then Jay, and finally Ezgi.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm very happy to be here, and I uh, would like to thank Lynn and the other panelists and the other organizers of this event. It's a great opportunity. As I understand it, my job in this panel is to help to provide some additional context to evangelicalism in American history and to discuss its implications for the role of religion in American public life. Evangelicalism, as Dr. Butler pointed out, is a complicated term with a rich history. Some of you know that the term evangelical comes from the Greek word, which is translated into English as the gospel or good news. During the Reformation era, evangelicalism was the original term used by movements that broke with the Catholic Church. The term Protestant was a later moniker that came in the second generation of the Reformation era. In American history and culture, evangelicalism has been employed to refer to a form of Protestant Christianity that involves an individual and transformative conversion experience that includes the conviction of one's sins and a renewal of one's life in the grace of Jesus Christ. This form of Christianity established itself as a force in American life during the great revival periods of the 18th and 19th centuries, referred to by historians as the First and Second Great Awakening. Self-described evangelical Christians can be found in a variety of denominations and non-denominational congregations, including among Methodists, Baptists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, and others. In the 20th century, one historian has quipped that during the 1950s and 60s, evangelicalism was well described as, quote, anyone who likes Billy Graham. And this takes us to the movement over the last 50 years or more. And this takes us more directly to the features described by Professor Butler in her presentation. In the second half of the 20th century, evangelicalism has become more closely associated with certain features of American political culture. This was so because prominent leaders within the evangelical movement became increasingly active in what we refer today as the culture wars. And they explicitly sought to advance Christian norms and values through political means. This type of political involvement stands in stark contrast, for example, to the Baptists of the 18th century who were strict separationists and who were instrumental in the development of the religion clauses that we find in the First Amendment. During the 1980s, figures such as Jerry Falwell with his moral majority, James Dobson with his focus on the family, and Pat Robertson with the 700 Club became the public face of evangelical Christianity, and the movement became too easily associated with Republican Party politics. Yet behind this simplistic portrayal of evangelicalism was a much more complicated reality. I mentioned at the outset, and Dr. Butler also underscores this point, that evangelicalism has a diverse range of movements and theologies and alignments and the like. Part of this history involves ideas and movements behind the recent wave of Christian nationalism we've been witnessing of late. Professor Butler made some broad connections with Pentecostalism and the church growth movement and the concept of these 7 mountains of power, which she very richly described, and which demonstrates just the way in which the different forms of Christian theology can fuse with other forms of American institutions. Another interesting movement that connects specifically with the concept of dominionism, so you recall that she used the word dominionism, is a movement known as Christian Reconstruction. Also associated with this is the Pentecostal kingdom now theology. But I want to just take a minute to talk about Christian Reconstruction, which began in the 1960s and advanced the idea that divine law and statutory law should be fused together into a society that they described as a theonomy. And theonomy is a term that brings together two Greek words, right? Theos, which is translated in English as God, and nomos, which is translated into English as law. So they were advocating an absolute theocracy in American society, and they believed that that was justifiable on the basis of biblical grounds. The founding figure in this movement is a man named R.J. Rushdoony, someone of whom you've likely never heard, but this is a figure who was tremendously influential on fundamentalist forms of Christianity and whose ideas found their way into the more mainstream forms of conservative evangelicalism. For example, he was an early and strong advocate for the homeschool movement. He advanced a theology of the nuclear family and a return to patriarchy, and he wanted to reintroduce biblical forms of punishment for violations of law. And some of these forms of punishment are the ones that we find in the Christian Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Professor Butler also made reference to the distinction between premillennial theology and postmillennial theology. Do you recall which form the movement she was describing advanced? Post or pre? Post. Okay, so I just wanted to take a minute just to kind of add a little bit and clarify that distinction, right? Within evangelical theology, there are forms of thought that believe that prior to the millennium, right, the 1,000-year period mentioned in the book of Revelation, that prior to this period that there would be tremendous destruction and that the destruction and violence would usher in a new kingdom of God in which Christ would rule for 1,000 years. So if you're familiar with the evangelical movements that advocate a kind of what they call the movements that advocate that prior to the return of Jesus, that the saved are going to rise, right, with Jesus, right, overthrow the wicked, and then reign. Those are premillennial movements. Those are the movements that are not part of what Butler's talking about. What Butler's describing are postmillennial movements which believe that it is their job to actually usher in the kingdom of God, and that we are living in the kingdom of God, and that their job is to bring it to the fore. So rather than waiting passively, right, for the destruction and the second coming of Jesus, they believe it is their job to actually usher it in. And this has been a point of some debate and contention, but it does explain why some of these groups are so active politically. So premillennial theologies, a lot of them advocate a more passive, individualized understanding of sin, right, and await the destruction of the world and the return of Jesus Christ. Postmillennial theologies, whether in their progressive forms or in their fundamentalist forms, right, believe that human action will usher it in. And the groups that Butler was talking about are the groups that believe that they need to return, right, that Christian nationalism is a way to usher in and actualize the millennium and the kingdom of God. So in closing, I just want to turn back to the central points of our presentation, namely that, one, in our current situation, movements that have historically been marginalized have now entered mainstream American discourse. That was clear, obviously. Secondly, they have entered mainstream discourse in large measure due to Donald Trump's embrace of these movements for his own political ends. And three, that this has opened up a Pandora's box of nationalist, cessationist, and theocratic movements. Dr. Butler's lecture provides a partial answer to the question of how Christian nationalism has emerged so quickly and so strongly in the political discourse here in the U.S. For example, in the last few weeks, Marjorie Taylor Greene has openly and explicitly advanced the idea of a return to Christian nationalism. This would have been unthinkable in American politics just 7 years ago. So Greene, Steve King, and Lauren Boebert and others are possible, right? The survival and power of these politicians and other leaders are here because they have tapped into something that has had a strong and lasting impact on millions of evangelical citizens in the U.S. This comes as a surprise to many Americans for a variety of reasons. And one reason that I'll note and then I'll close is that the media has done a generally poor job of helping the public to understand the nuances and varieties of American religion. Too often, media figures who cover religion don't have an understanding of the groups that they're reporting on. So in some cases, they don't recognize the subtleties and the diversity within these movements. In other cases, they just find it easy to return back to simplistic explanations for what they're covering rather than drilling deeper into the sources. And especially the religious sources of the motivation behind a lot of these movements. And so the American public is left wondering, how did this come to be? How is this explainable? And I think a very careful and nuanced understanding of areas in American life that we just haven't paid much attention to and the broader public isn't aware of is an important feature. And I think Dr. Butler does a nice job of pulling out those connections. And so I was happy to know that we wanted to view this today and to be part of this panel. So thank you very much.
Well, Jay's coming to do his part. I should remind you that there is pizza in the back of the room, and I don't think Brian wants to take all of it home. So
My daughter would eat it all.
so feel free to partake.
Can I go get some right now?
Speak.
I speak with my mouth full. First of all, I want to thank Lynn for his very gracious introduction of me. Full disclosure, I am his department chair, so that will be noted in his annual review next year. I mean, I'm a Minnesota boy, the land of Lake Wobegon, where all the kids are above average, so that's kind of how I approach my own credentials. I don't think I deserved the glowing introduction he gave me, but thank you very much. Democracy is messy. It's this notion of a free exchange of ideas. There's thoughtful discourse and in the idea of the marketplace of ideas that ultimately the best idea wins in that thoughtful discourse. Well, that's an idealized notion that's actually how it works. It assumes what I call are the three I's that are absolutely critical for democracy to function the way the framers really thought it should. Those three R's involve a citizenry that is interested, informed, and involved. And the reality is the citizenry do not live up to those expectations. And that's gotten us into the situation that we are currently in. Reality doesn't really comport to that. And we're not all James Madisons running around talking about the structure of government and how it all works. Now, the framers, to their credit, realized that that was probably not going to happen, that we weren't going to have a citizenry that lived up to the democratic ideal. And you can see evidence of it in the formation of our Constitution. There is a deep mistrust. If you read the Federalist Papers that document the debate about our Constitution and what it should look like, running through the discussion is this deep mistrust of the masses, that they really don't understand the intricacies of government. Because after all, politics is boring. And I know that because I'm a political science professor. Okay? Politics is not a happy subject. It's the subject that we're told not to talk about. In fact, religion is the other thing we're told not to talk about. And here we are talking about both of them. So you can see this in the design of our Constitution. I think the Electoral College really is emblematic of the deep mistrust that the framers had, this lack of confidence in the ability of the electorate to actually understand the intricacies of politics and government. That's why they put the process of selecting a president in the hands of the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College that we know today doesn't work at all like what the framers had intended, but that's a completely different discussion. But that it's sort of the idea that I'm trying to get at here is that we don't live up as citizens to the democratic ideal. Now, to throw a political science perspective into this, in the 1950s and 60s, when political science was really becoming political science, it wasn't just the study of constitutions anymore. We were looking at the behavior of citizens, like I'm talking about now. And one of the big questions that came up in the 1960s in the study of political behavior and attitudes was this notion of, how does democracy survive? How does it work? Because the notion of democracy is based on the principle that we, the masses, keep it going. It's a system of popular sovereignty where the people are sovereign. And we have to have some basic level of support to keep the system going. And so political scientists in the 1960s really started looking at, well, what is the base of support among the citizenry? What basic values do we hold as citizens to ensure that the political system keeps running? And the answers they started to get were very troubling. When we started interviewing people, I was there, I was a kid. Okay, so political science is a discipline. We started asking people about very basic principles of support for the political system, the notions of democratic values, of majority rule and minority rights and tolerance for alternative points of view. And the evidence we were getting back in those surveys really showed that democracy was on very, very tenuous grounds. That the people don't necessarily exemplify the values that are crucial to the survival of democracy. And so we began to ask questions. Well, then how does democracy survive? And how has it survived for almost 200 years at that point? And one of the answers that was forwarded then was this notion of what's called democratic elitism, the theory of democratic elitism. Because when we started looking at these questions a little bit further, we found that while the citizenry is on shaky ground as far as support for these democratic ideals, elected officials, the political elites, did hold those values. And so the idea was basically what keeps democracy alive and keeps it moving forward is that the people that we put in those positions of power hold the views that are necessary for it to survive. Now, that's a very shaky notion because it's entirely dependent upon the people we put into power holding those views and reinforcing, to use the term that Lynn introduced to us, is reinforcing the frame that this is how the game is played. We had the provost here yesterday. He was talking about the rules of basketball. And then Lynn's here talking about the rules of baseball. I feel compelled somehow to bring a sports analogy in it, but I don't have one. I could talk about curling, but that doesn't really fit here. I am a Minnesota boy after all. In any event, this notion that of the theory of democratic elitism is then basically premised on this notion that the elected officials are the ones to keep it moving. And as long as they hold on to the frame, as long as they follow the rules and run to first base instead of third, then it survives. And that passes on from generation to generation to generation. Well, as Lynn points out, that isn't necessarily the case anymore. To drive it deeper into this notion of political science research, where does the people come in? The people come in because ultimately our opinions are the ones that are sort of supposed to be driving the process. Early research on public opinion formation, and continued on for many decades, basically reinforces the notion that we get our opinions from our elites. You know, our opinions don't just pop into our head one day and, you know, we wake up one morning and go, oh, I'm a Republican this morning. You know, it doesn't work that way. It comes through socialization. It comes through experience. It comes from hearing what other people say. People in positions of authority, opinion leaders. It's not just elected officials, but the people we look up to. We base our opinions on what we hear from them. And if we don't know what to think, then we look to someone to tell us what to think. And so the notion of democratic elitism then it reinforces itself as long as we're getting that message from the elites, that this is the way the game is played, and this is how we follow the rules. Now, the problem is that because the masses, the average citizen, is not very interested in politics, doesn't necessarily follow it very closely, we tend to take a very sort of ends justifies the means position. We know what we want. We don't necessarily know how the game is played because politics is boring and I don't want to watch it. Okay, I'd rather watch Wheel of Fortune. I understand those rules. Okay, and so what we have is, I know what policy goals I have. I know what I want to have in the end. I know what I want the government to do. I don't care how they do it, just as long as they do it. They give me the things that I want. And that's where it becomes really problematic, particularly in light of the conversation we're having today. When you juxtapose that perspective with religion, it's a very dangerous combination. Religion, you know, is based on the principle that I believe something by way of faith. And at the core of that is the lack of evidence. I believe this because I believe it. And I don't need evidence to support that idea. And along with that is this absolute certainty that I'm correct in that belief. That I have the correct answer because I am getting this, you know, as a part of my religion. Well, that's problematic in the sense that our system of government is largely based on the principle of compromise. And when you have an absolute belief that what your view is correct, you're not going to be very willing to compromise. And when someone comes along and tells you that we have to change the rules of the game or that the rules of the game don't matter, that just feeds this notion of, I don't have to listen to the other side. That ain't going to work in a system where nothing really gets done unless there's compromise. And of course, we've been seeing over the last couple of decades, compromise is becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. So when you have a member of the political elite preaching anti-democratic notions, preaching changing or not following the rules of the game, it tears the fragile fabric of democracy. So people believe that the election was stolen, not because the election was actually stolen, but because they were told that the election was stolen by a person who is helping them get the policy goals that they want. The election was not stolen. Donald Trump had plenty of opportunities to plead his case in a court of law time and 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 time again. Okay? And he was stopped at every attempt. Not because they were trying to stop him, but because he had no evidence. That the evidence he did try to present was really nothing at all. Yes, there is voter fraud in every election, but it's nowhere near as widespread as what Donald Trump tried to allege. There have been audits of elections over and over again, particularly in those states where it mattered. I mean, Utah is not a state that generally matters in elections. But in the states that mattered, there were many attempts to take a look at what has happened. And while there were handfuls of election fraud found, I mean, they found election fraud here in Utah. Nefarious actions of moms signing ballots for their missionary sons. That was the incidence, the most common incidence of election fraud here in Utah was moms signing the ballot for their missionary sons. Not enough to tip the balance of the election, and not really deep state-ish, if you look at it. So the concern here really is, how do we address this? And honestly, I don't know, other than to suggest that everybody needs to take a political science class. We all need to be better informed about the rules of the game. We all need to understand the processes that we have in place, because that's how we defend against the arguments that the election was stolen. If we can say with certainty, no, it wasn't, and here's why, because here are the mechanisms that are in place to prevent it from happening, it means that you have to have an awful lot of trust in the election officials. And I don't think there is, simply because we don't know who these people are. But these are decent, honest people who just want to do their jobs. And the more we understand that that's all they are, and they're not these nefarious villains trying to advance some evil cause, then, you know, we're not going to get anywhere unless we actually reinforce that. So I don't know how we get out of this mess other than becoming more involved, more informed, more interested, so that we can stand guard and be more of the support system that the political system needs to survive and continue. I'm done.
See whether it will stand here. Okay, that should work. Okay, so thank you so much, Lynn, for inviting me to be part of this panel as well. And thanks a lot for being here late Friday afternoon. We'll all appreciate that. So I joked about this yesterday, but I am gonna start with a disclaimer that I am not an expert on theology and religion. So I will not have a lot to say about that. However, I do work in epistemology, which means I work in questions related to knowledge. And I've been naturally thinking a lot about the relationship between belief, knowledge, ignorance, and power, especially in the social and political context. So when I think about the multiple issues that were raised in Professor Butler's talk that we just saw, such as nationalism or racism or threats to democracy, I mostly think about what it means to know the world and then act on the world that we claim to know. So when I ask these questions in this context, I realized, or just listening to this talk also, two things kind of came to my mind. And one of them is one theme, if you want to call it that, a core theme for me was this struggle over what the world is like. And that is something that I want to talk about briefly. And also another theme is the complicated relationship between knowledge and ignorance, especially in the context of racism and nationalism. So I'm going to start with the struggle over what the world is like. When we heard this during the talk as well, there's a lot of questions around what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with the situation, how do we understand the world, how are you understanding the world. So we keep hearing the world, the world, the world, the world. So because it seems like there is a real question about in how we make sense of our reality. And there seems to be a very clear clash in how people are making sense of their reality and understanding it. And that is kind of important in questions like this or in discussions like this. So if I ask you to complete this sentence today, the world is like ... I'm pretty sure that I'll get a variety of responses because there's always an interpretation, which is kind of what Lynn initially talked about, the framing. There's always an interpretation involved in the way we know the world. And of course, this interpretation doesn't come out of nowhere. It is situated in the social and the institutional and political context. And the socialization, like Jay was talking about, we learn to think about these interpretations, or we even learn these interpretations themselves in our communities, in our institutions, and in that social and political process. So to me, what's interesting is this relationship between the belief, what I'm believing, and the world. Because we can think about that relationship in many different ways, but very simply, belief can correspond to how the world is, right? So let's assume that I'm taking a walk in an area that I've never been before, and I don't know much about the plants in that area, and I usually don't, so this would be a fitting example. And I see, even if I don't know what to call, like what colors or shapes are, I can easily say, okay, I believe that looking at the different colors I see or different shapes that I see, even though I don't know their names, I can say, I believe that there are different shapes and colors in this part, in this region. I can have a belief that seems to correspond to the world. But what's interesting in cases like this, or in discussions like this, is that we can also, and we've been doing so, we can make the world conform to our beliefs, that the world could be made to conform to our beliefs. And what do I mean by that? So just two examples that I thought I would mention here. For instance, I'm thinking about the institutionalized practices around collecting and interpreting data that slowly but surely build a relationship between race and crime. and show crime as an inherent feature of blackness. Like this is something Khalil Gibran Muhammad studies and shows that, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, statistics and sociology were used on purpose to build crime into as an inherent feature of blackness. So that's a thing that we do. We make the world conform to our belief systems. And we show it like that. We pretend that it is like that. Or a very recent example, as Dorothy Roberts discusses, another sociologist that looks into racism in the 21st century, especially in genomics research, when we seen with the Human Genome Project that there was no biological basis for racism. Even after then, a lot of the scientific genomic research projects try to sweep race through different categories, such as ancestry, such as geographical ancestry. And they will do this through particular computer programming practices and just kind of pretend that somehow the grouping of human beings that they were studying, aligning with these older categories that were not biologically meaningful. So again, another case of making the world conform to a certain belief system. So to me, these examples show that we really have to be thinking carefully about the role of institutions, and we have to really interrogate the role that they play in establishing what the world is like. What have they been doing so far? What kind of a world that they've been building and acting upon at the same time? So you can think about the healthcare system, you can think about the education, the criminal justice system, the political system, the sort of the democratic elitism that we just talked about. We can think about how these institutions function and what kinds of worlds they are claiming to be building and acting upon, again, at the same time. So when I ask these questions, to me, one of the things that I found myself thinking about listening to this lecture was how politics always involves a struggle over what the world is like. And democracy does not necessarily mean that that struggle over what the world is like has ended. This is a political struggle as much as an epistemic struggle. It almost seems impossible to separate them, but it is a vital struggle. And in political advocacy, you see that, and we've seen it here as well, that there are always new old worlds that are being built, being assumed, being postulated. And when people are narrating about how the current state of affairs are, how the world works, they are not just trying to appear rational, they are kind of using these ideas of the world as what they think they know. And of course, what they think they know and how they act are not completely unrelated. So, and another thing that I wanted to mention in this context is, if I think about politics as this struggle over what the world is like, to me it seems like, call it maybe some social groups or political groups, that there are definitely some groups who have forgotten that it has always been a struggle over the state of affairs and what the world is like and the way the world works. And yes, I can throw some shade to liberal approaches here, and especially liberal approaches to politics, the approaches where people assume that there is one rationality and everyone is free to make up their mind, everyone is entitled to their opinion, you can agree to disagree because you're just looking at the evidence and the facts. And that attitude actually presents a complete oblivion towards what the politics are actually about governance, about how the world works or should work. And it's important to remember that I think there is, and there will always be lives at stake in the way in which, in the postulations of what the world is like. So I think that also kind of touches upon why some people are very surprised that the democracy seems very fragile. Or it should also kind of make us think a little bit about who was able to forget that the politics are about what the world is like, and who was kind of not able to or not couldn't afford to forget that that was what politics are about. So this is also something that I want to kind of tie to the importance of attention. And this came up in Brian's talk as well. Just, I think, thinking about what we have been attending to, how we are attending to it, what are our habits and practices of attention when we think about politics. And that really seems to be crucial here. And as Professor Butler mentioned in the talk, most of the people who are surprised by the state of political movements, they have not paid much attention clearly to what has been happening in the last 30 to 50 years. And I think that's important, again, that lack of attention and for which reasons. So the struggle over what the world is like is also very much related to a problematic distinction between believers and political actors. Because so sometimes there is this assumption that the believers are different than political actors, but when we think about the belief system and when we think about what the belief system can do in our interactions with the world, we can see that there's the thinking separately is not perhaps ideal in these circumstances, because eventually the belief systems also are about, again, kind of having power over trying to decide what the shared reality is going to look like, or power over how the world should be like, and power over how the institutions should function. So that's kind of one part of what I wanted to emphasize about the struggle of what the world is like. The very, very final point that I want to talk briefly about is this dynamic between knowledge and ignorance in practices of racism and nationalism. So, as we have also heard in the panel earlier, democracy seems to rely upon a lot of assumptions, and assumptions about how our day-to-day and how our society is going to function. And one of those assumptions is the assumption that there is going to be a healthy circulation of knowledge, there's going to be healthy practices of knowledge production, where we're going to hear from everyone, where we're going to be able to see and understand all the perspectives and the standpoints that are being involved. And obviously, when we have practices of racism and nationalism in these assumed democratic settings, what happens is that the racism and nationalism, and particularly in this case, right, the white Christian nationalism that she was talking about, they introduce a very particular hierarchies of being, but also very clear logics of purity. And when you have very clear hierarchies and clear logics of purity, usually there is a very clear hierarchy of understandings as well. So basically this means that, depending on where you stand on that hierarchy, that certain ways in which you understand the world, certain ways in which you think about the world, they are not going to be seen as credible. You are not going to be believed. But also, beyond that, some of the racist and nationalist dynamics in democratic systems also erase systematically and consistently the ways in which people have been making sense of the world. So it's important to highlight that important dynamic of racism and nationalism in a democratic context is also this constant suppression of certain knowledges and certain kinds of knowledges, and also how that really goes hand in hand with the creation of active, willful ignorance. Or that when people think about knowledge production, usually there's this assumption about ignorance getting less and less, right? But depending on how we are producing knowledge, whose knowledges we are taking seriously, whose interpretive methods we are taking seriously, is going to result in certain kind of ignorance also being produced very actively, willfully, and maintained and sustained to legitimize the knowledge production that is taking place. I end there. Thank you.
We do have 10 minutes for questions or comments from you. I think we have microphones to travel. And before you make your comment or your question, it is important to allow the persons with the microphones to reach you so that it'll be picked up by the sound system and recorded. So, you have comments? Questions? We've got one back here in the far corner.
I don't remember your name, the guy in the green shirt.
Yes.
Jay.
Jay.
Jay, yes. I guess my question kind of mostly probably pertains to you. Because you talked a lot about the election fraud and the voter fraud and like how there's just so many people that don't believe that it might have happened. Do you think that similarly like to COVID and like the mistrust in the media, partially with the whole like fake news, but just like how the media hasn't been completely, I mean, in some instances they're not completely honest and might be biased in a lot of ways, but the mistrust in the media within the general population, do you think that plays a lot into the fact that people still don't trust the election fraud or the election of 2020?
I think there's some element of that. I mean, on top of all of this, you do have this media structure that has become just as polarized as the elected officials are. In fact, I would argue that the polarization of the media almost predates the polarization of the elected officials. And so we become siloed in our sources of information that it kind of goes along with this idea, well, I don't have to listen to the evidence that's being presented to me by those people because they're lying to me. The people I trust are telling me that this is the way it is. And it gets to that point where we become so entrenched in our views that we don't want to hear anything that conflicts with that. And so, yes, there's mistrust of the media. Which media we trust is probably a more important question than just generally trust in the media. Because you get folks over here, they'll say, well, I'll only trust MSNBC. And folks over here that'll say, well, I'll only trust Fox News. And then the rest of us are just like, well, I don't even watch the news. I watch Wheel of Fortune. And that's the fundamental problem. It's the Wheel of Fortune folks that need to become a little bit more interested and involved to kind of temper this discussion and bridge the gap between the MSNBC folks and the Fox News folks. That's, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it sort of, the media is a key player here. It just, I don't know how to fix it.
Yes, I think you have a lot of great ideas because I've been thinking a lot about these issues for a while. And I think about, how the culture wars, which didn't start with Donald Trump, okay, merge with the extreme partisanship, which I trace back, it goes a long way, but there's Newt Gingrich, who believed that the parties should be at war with one another. And it's, of course, we've reached the extremes of the culture wars and the extreme partisanship now, where people can't talk to each other, okay? And they get penalized if they try, which I think is really, really depressing. So, the question to me is, how do you bridge all that? How do you build a bridge back to where, there are some people trying, but of course my answer is you just completely change the political elite by having rules like term limits and things of that sort, so that you get different voices in positions where the voices seem to matter. I think also I've thought a lot about Donald Trump's faux reality. And it was an answer to people who felt vulnerable, is the way I think about it. And, how do you make those? Well, you have to change the structure of our society and the inequalities in our society so there are fewer people who feel vulnerable, who feel their status is being threatened, That's why they're afraid of the demographic changes that are dramatically changing our society. So I thank you for the many ideas, and now I'm going to have to reprocess some of the things I've been thinking about. I appreciate it.
Do any of you have any comments about his comment?
You're right. My ideas are wonderful. No, you're right. I think it is a difficult puzzle to unravel. I know I mixed my metaphors there because you don't unravel puzzles; you try to put them together. But it is a challenge, and I don't know the way back from the hyperpartisanship that we have. Because it's so entrenched in this idea that I was trying to talk about, this idea that my view is the correct view. And I can't speak out against the people on my side because I'm still getting what I want. The ends justify the means. So as long as I can get, for example, pro-choice or pro-life judges on the bench, I can put up with Donald Trump's nonsense, right? I mean, you got undercurrents of that throughout his presidency, that there were people that, well, he makes me uncomfortable, but I'm getting what I want. And so there was this incentive for folks to not speak out against the non-democratic values, things that were coming from, because they were still getting the policy goals they wanted. And the only solution I see there is for people like Liz Cheney, who are from that side, to speak out against it. And the more you have folks like that speaking out against the anti-democratic values, the more it's going to sort of dig in the notion of democratic values.
Gabe?
Yeah, thank you. So two questions. At the first, I would say, what do you all make about like participation levels in the U.S. for democratic processes? What does it mean to be a democracy when like almost half of the country doesn't vote consistently? And the second question is, I think that the hyper-partisan rhetoric is kind of tired, to be honest, and insidious in some ways, because there are policies in the U.S. that have been consistent for decades, including things like funding the Pentagon to incredible levels without question or debate. So I think to the point that you've made and what we heard, though there are factions within the government that are definitely at odds, what are the factions that are making sure that this status quo remains? And also that are keeping people unwilling, uninterested, but angry uninterested in participating, but angry at the government. So how do those things coexist?
I feel like I'm dominating the Q&A, so I was pausing just to see if anybody else wanted to talk. I think it does tie into the lack of political trust, that there is this pervasive sense that government isn't really run for the interests of all, but rather the interests of the few, the interests of the moneyed elites. There's certainly evidence that that's true. We have a fundamental challenge in trying to overcome that, and that is in the way in which the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment, that money equals speech. And as long as that is the pervasive view of the Supreme Court in the interpretation and application of campaign finance laws, money is going to continue to find a way into our process, no matter what we try to do to limit it. There needs to be a fundamental change in the way in which campaigns are financed, which means there needs to be a fundamental change in the Constitution if the Supreme Court is going to continue to interpret the First Amendment the way it is. As long as money is equated to speech by the Supreme Court, there's no way to really combat the issue of the entrenchment of moneyed interests in our political system, other than people getting involved not just politically by voting, but also with their pocketbooks. And convincing them to part with their money to give it to a politician, that's tough, right? I mean, I was a Cub Scout leader. I would take my little Cub Scouts to sell popcorn. Getting people to just give money for popcorn is hard enough for these little Cub Scouts. Getting them to give money to a politician? Oh, forget it. So it is an uphill battle, and I don't know a way to deal with it unless there is fundamental shift in how we deal with campaign finance in the United States.
Okay, so I think one thing so we kind of watched only the lecture part of Professor Butler's talk. So if you watch that video, the rest of it, she does a Q&A with some of the people who are listening to the lecture. And one of the things that she says, which reminded me of your kind of part of your participation question, is like, go to school board meetings. Like, engage. And I think that, and that kind of really made me think about the levels of participation and the levels of attention that we've been talking about, and how, when we think about politics, how it's kind of always thought in just generally in terms of participating in the electoral part of it, but not really having a sense of what doing politics means day to day and every day, and engaging with the institutions that people have to engage day to day. And I think that, like, thinking about how to do that, and there are a lot of people who are doing that, and actually working them and learning from them how to do that is, I think, a very important step in this process as well.
So, Jenna, you had a question. And this will be our last question.
Make it good.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll try. Oh, it's pressure. Thank you all for this panel. I love the interdisciplinary nature of the panel, because I think we had political science, philosophy, maybe history and sociology approaches to the same question. Religious studies, right? Peace and justice studies. Any other programs I need to put in a plug for? I think a lot of the questions were about the political side of this panel, and my question is maybe more about the religious side of it. And I think I think part of the argument in Dr. Butler's lecture was that this movement has become almost a political movement more than a religious one, or, I mean, it's both, but the political side of it has become new and different and important in a way that's different than 20 years ago or 50 years ago. So I think we've had a lot of good suggestions about ways to change our politics or come to a better understanding of how democracy works. But my question is maybe what can happen within churches or within religious traditions or between religious traditions, because it seems like part of the argument in the video was this is a sort of radical strain of Christianity that has taken over in some ways. So how can maybe other Christians or other people of other denominations and religions, or people of no denomination or religion, talk to each other in ways that maybe get to some of these same questions that we're having in our political process? Like, I guess coming from that angle, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. You raised an important part of her presentation that I didn't underscore, and that is that she is interested in expanding the definition of evangelicalism to, in a more holistic way, to call it really a cultural phenomenon, and not limit it to merely a theological, set of issues. And I think that was very astute and right on point. And I think it goes to the question of why these movements have been misunderstood or out of view for much of American society, because the way in which we cover, and back to the media, the way in which the media covers it is they have a tendency to look at other dynamics. Almost, I already mentioned the fact that there's just a level of ignorance out there, even among otherwise very well-educated people, about religion. So I thought, thank you for bringing that up. In terms of the question of, what can happen in order to create, a broader understanding of this, part of it is just making people aware of the potency of these movements like Dr. Butler did, and showing the kind of power they've had both in American history and the way in which they've been marginalized, both within the Christian Protestant context, but also within our political culture, right? And why that kind of marginalization has almost created a kind of built-up force, right? That once unleashed, has a stronger power than it otherwise would have had if it were not, if it were acknowledged. And in terms of the radicalism, I mean, there's a kind of reflective, descriptive, scientific way of saying, well, these movements are radical because they're designated as radical because they've been marginalized. And in, for much of American history, a lot of these ideas were not that radical, or they were not understood to be radical. They were designated as radical by the elite power structure and institutions that helped to define and present the picture of American history and culture that we've been the recipients of.
Would like to thank all of you. I think just in a quick couple of sentence summary, in some ways, I hope you see and take an image that I get from George Lukács, a Hungarian philosopher. And in his writings, he argues that at times when there are processes in motion, that they have a tendency to mushroom and to become a juggernaut that runs like a locomotive going at high speed and driving off into the abyss, he says. And I think you're in a time when there is a juggernaut forming, and you'd better be involved, or as the system collapses into oblivion, you will have no control over it. That there's a time for control and a time where there will be no control, and you'd better insert yourselves while there's the opportunity. I am grateful to you for being here, especially again on a Friday afternoon. I'm grateful to the panel for their efforts at preparing and their willingness to participate. I always love being part of some of these things with my colleagues because I come away with such a sense of pride in their insightfulness, and the idea that I'm part of what they're doing is really invigorating. And I'm grateful to them for the insightfulness and the remarks that they have made. And I'm grateful to you for your participation. And as you leave,
Take some pizza.
there's pizza. And let's give the panel one more round.
I just want to thank Lynn, too, for putting this panel together and for being such a great colleague. Thank you, Lynn.